It's a revelation. It's totally empowering. And that method becomes more effective with repetition.
We're normally told that there's like this inexorable decline over time, whereas actually we have plenty of evidence that suggests that we can reverse that as long as we improve some of these factors.
It's going to be good for your brain globally as your mind, thoughts and emotions, as well as the flesh. That's one strong way to stave off dementia.
I mean, you have widely popularized the 4-7-8 breath.
Yep.
Can you tell us what the 4-7-8 breath is? And, when did this start coming into your awareness and when did you start talking about it?
It's a yoga technique. So again, thousands of years old. And I learned it from Dr. Fulford. And I've been practicing it since probably the early 1980s, and I have taught it. I teach it to every patient I come into contact with, to all of my students, sometimes to very large groups of people. It's so time efficient. It's just, the method is simply breathing in quietly through your nose to a count of 4, holding your breath for a count of 7, and blowing air out forcibly through your mouth to a count of 8, and repeating that for 4 breath cycles when you're first learning it, and doing that twice a day religiously, and that's all. And by simply doing that over time, over the space of a month or 2 months, you really change the dynamics of the involuntary nervous system. Decrease sympathetic tone, increase parasympathetic tone. The relaxation response lowers heart rate, lowers blood pressure, improves digestion, really amazing results. And it takes 30 seconds twice a day.
I mean, I love recommendations like that, very, very effective, but free and accessible to everybody, which I think is something that I always try and keep at the back of my mind when talking about health. There's this theme coming up, Andrew, which is, you mentioned inflammation before. You were becoming aware in the maybe early 80s that there's this kind of root cause of chronic unresolved inflammation that may be behind, or at least contributing in a large way, to things like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, depression, whatever. It's like, okay, great. You also mentioned that you teach the 4-7-8 breath to pretty much every single one of your patients. So what I really love is this understanding and this idea that there are some basics of health, right? There are some commonalities that if we focus on the creation of health in the body, if we focus on reducing inflammation in the body through hopefully lots of lifestyle practices, we can tackle multiple different diseases, even though we're not targeting them specifically. And it's, as you say, that 4-7-8 breath, it sounds like you use that as prevention, as prophylaxis, but also as treatment when somebody has a problem. And I think this is in many ways changing the way that we look at medicine, because we have been taught in a certainly I was trained, maybe 30, 35 years after you, but a very sort of quite a reductionist model. We're very good at giving labels to different diseases. We separate off the body into different specialities, and that can have value, but also we forget that we're one interconnecting system. And if you change one part of that system, you also have a knock-on effect on other parts as well.
Yeah, let me give you an example with the 4-7-8 breath. This is by far the most effective anti-anxiety measure that I've come across. It makes the drugs that we use for anxiety look very pathetic by comparison. And I have used that in patients with the most extreme forms of panic disorder successfully, although in some cases it took some time of regular practice for them to get control of it. But the difference between treating an anxiety attack or panic disorder with a drug like a benzodiazepine and with the 4-7-8 breath, it's a very stark contrast. When people are panicked or in anxiety states, the subjective experience usually is of being out of control. If you deal with that by giving a medication, you reinforce the false idea that the locus of control is external. And over time, that method becomes less and less effective and often creates dependence. When a person discovers that they have within them the ability to control an anxiety state by regulation of the breath, it's a revelation. It's totally empowering. And that method becomes more effective with repetition and creates greater independence and greater autonomy. I mean, it just couldn't be a greater contrast of those two approaches.
Yeah, completely agree. It's about connecting the patient to what's going on, the feeling that they have got some control over. Otherwise, I agree. It's not only the fact that the treatment itself has very few, if any, side effects, right? So but it's also, it's also that empowerment. And I guess that kind of leads on to this term mind-body medicine, which I've heard you talk about a lot. And I think it's worth kind of really trying to understand, what do you mean when you say mind-body medicine? Do you see the mind and body as separate? Does society see it as separate? And what does that umbrella term really mean?
I think the only way you can separate mind and body is verbally. I think they are two poles of the same reality. And I think the reigning paradigm in Western science and medicine simply does not see that, that we have a materialistic paradigm in place that states that all that is real is that which is physical, that which can be touched, measured, I guess in medicine, taken out, and that if you observe a change in a physical system, the cause has to be physical. Non-physical causation of physical events simply is not allowed for in that paradigm. And this is why mind-body interactions have been never accorded their proper due, why research in that area has been stunted, why hypnosis has never been fully accepted as a medical modality, for example, why we can't make sense of wart cures. I mean, there's a whole range of things, but that is changing. And some of the change has come about with validating placebo responses through brain imaging and showing that there are correlations with activity in particular areas of the brain. So this makes it accessible to people, gradually changing. But I would say there's a whole range of therapies under the heading mind-body medicine, from biofeedback, hypnosis, visualization, and so forth. In general, these methods are very cost-effective, time-effective, even fun for both practitioner and patient, and yet they are very underutilized in medicine. And they're underutilized because we just don't take this kind of stuff seriously. In my clinical experience, I have again and again seen that the root causes of illness are in the non-physical compartment. Unless that's dealt with, all the physical intervention that you do is not going to solve the problem. It's tricky sometimes to present this to patients because many patients are very sensitive to being accused of making up their illness or imagining it, that it's all in their head, and that's not what is meant by this. It's very difficult to use the term psychosomatic because of that connotation.
I don't think as a profession, we've got a bit of a bad reputation in the past.
Yep.
Telling people that their IBS, their irritable bowel syndrome, is sort of kind of in their head, or their fibromyalgia is sort of in their head. And I think so there's a real defensiveness from people, understandably, right. The doctor's telling me it's in my head.
IBS is clearly in the bowel as well as in the head, and everything is in both.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? The mind and the body. And I guess now we're getting this field of research, which I'm interested as to what state this was in the 60s and 70s. But, the last 5-10 years, we've got the microbiome, the gut-brain axis, lots of research showing this bidirectional communication between body, our gut, and the mind in our brains. And, were you aware of this early on? What did the research say, or did you just intuitively and through your experience know that this was going on?
I took a course in medical hypnosis at Columbia University right after I finished my internship. It was one of the most fascinating courses I ever took, and certainly made me aware of the research that was out there, and it totally resonated with my own interests. So I've paid attention to that for a long time. I have a colleague that I worked with for many years who's on our faculty. Who is a teaching member of the American Academy of Clinical Hypnosis. And I've sent him many patients. And I remember early on him saying to me that he thought that every dermatological patient and every GI patient should first go to hypnotherapy before they went to dermatologists or gastroenterologists, because those two systems of the body have the highest ratio of innervation and connection to the mind. And I've absolutely found that to be true. And another experience I had shortly after he said that, the leading gastroenterologist in Tucson asked me to have dinner with him. He's in his 60s, and he was very depressed and said that he hoped that I had something that could help him, because he said 90% of the patients that he saw had conditions for which his training did not equip him to do anything about. I mean, that's remarkable. And I think this is absolutely the way it is. And it's not just for GI disorders and dermatological disorders. It applies to many other things as well. And that doesn't mean you should not work on the physical problem, but you want to also be working on the non-physical aspect of it.
Well, there's two things that come to mind there. That 90% statistic is a very striking one. And what's interesting to me is that I would agree with that, actually. There's so much of what we see, we don't, certainly as medical doctors, we don't have tools that work really well for them. Yet I don't know what it is about. I'm not trying to get too down on my profession at all. I'm very proud to be a medical doctor. I'm pleased I went through, like you, that conventional medical training. But I do feel sometimes that there's a certain arrogance within the profession, or I don't know what happens at medical school, where you go in as a kind of open-minded, curious individual, and you come out, or many of us come out, quite close-minded, thinking we know it all, and actually anything that we weren't taught has no value. And because, a real striking moment for me, Andrew, was one of my days as a general practitioner. I moved from specialism into general practice. I was getting quite frustrated with just looking at kidneys, and I really wanted to see how everything linked together. And I remember one day I'd seen, I think, close to 50 patients, and I was a bit frustrated. And before I left the clinic to go home, I went through the whole list, and I asked myself, okay, Rangan, how many patients have you really, really helped today? And I honestly thought it was about 20%. I thought, yeah, those 20%, I think I've really done something cool. The other 80%, I've referred them somewhere, I've given them something to suppress a symptom, but I didn't really understand what was going on. I knew that they would be back. And I thought, I can't do this for 30, 40 years. There must be more to this than that, right? So why is it that some of us look at that with honesty and transparency and go, actually, we're really good at this stuff, we're not so good at that stuff? And why is it that others kind of almost ignore that and just stay within that system of going, no, this is the way to do it? Do have you got any answers there? What goes on there?
Well, I consider myself an open-minded skeptic. I'm willing to look at anything, believe anything, but then I need to see proof. I need to confirm that with my own experience. A lot of people that I run into in medicine and science generally, I would say, are closed-minded skeptics, which is very different. And I think in medicine, especially, there is a tendency to be suspicious of, defensive about any information that comes from unfamiliar sources. So a lot of the ideas that are out there in the world of alternative medicine, anything of that sort is just dismissed as nonsense without even paying attention to it. The dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona, who gave me the green light to start this center years ago, Jim Dolan, he was a cardiologist and had been a psychologist as an undergraduate, which has probably accounted for some of his openness to this. When he retired, he said that the achievement he was most proud of in his career was starting the Integrative Medicine Center. And he told this, said this about all the flack that he got for allowing this to happen. And he told a story about the attitudes of people in our profession. And I think it's interesting. The observation that aspirin was an anticoagulant and may have a preventive effect in coronary artery disease was first made, I think it was in the 1950s, by a general practitioner in Kansas who noticed that when he was taking aspirin, noticed that when he cut himself shaving that he bled more than usual. So he thought maybe aspirin was responsible for this. He started giving aspirin to some of his friends and confirming this effect. And he wrote an article in a journal of general practice saying that aspirin had anticoagulant activities and might be useful as a preventive in coronary artery disease. It took something like 30 years for the medical profession to come around to that point of view. And a major reason why they didn't was that this had been proposed by a general practitioner and published in a journal that cardiologists didn't read. And it was dismissed as an outrageous idea. And that's within the profession. So imagine when something comes from the world of traditional Chinese medicine or the world of herbal medicine, that provokes this kind of the same sort of response.
When you were giving the definition of integrated medicine, I think you used the word conventional medicine within it. And you just mentioned the phrase traditional Chinese medicine. And it's an interesting thought, isn't it? When we talk about conventional medicine or traditional medicine, it's, again, there's a sort of inbuilt arrogance there. It's like, well,
yes, it is. But our system of medicine is not that old. And if you're going to call something traditional, I think it should be at least 1,000 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Native American medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, but not what we're doing today as allopathic medicine. I mean, that only goes back maybe 100 years.
I mean, what is incredible is to see, as you said, with breathing, but there's a lot of science now coming out, isn't there, to support what these ancient healing modalities, traditional Chinese medicine, Indian Ayurvedic medicine, have been talking about for years, whether it's a period of time each day without food or, a period of time every 24 hours where you're not putting food in, whether it's breathing practices, whether it's the fact that different organs have different genetic activity and that they're more or less active at different parts of the day. I remember the Guardian newspaper in the UK covered a study maybe 2 or 3 years ago, which was showing, it was about the circadian clock and how the liver is more and less active at certain parts of the day. Other organs are as well. And the kind of conclusion was, so we can then use different medications at different times in the day. And okay, that may be one of the conclusions, but I was also thinking, have traditional Chinese medicine and Indian medicine not been saying this for thousands of years, that there's a different rhythm to different organs at different times of the day? And I guess for you, as someone who's been preaching this message for a good 50 years, you're now seeing a lot more mainstream support in a way that you presumably weren't 40, 50 years ago. I guess for some of these other modalities, not that they need it, I guess, but it must be quite gratifying to see, these guys are kind of catching up to what we already knew.
As I say, there are ideas in these systems that to me seem so powerful and useful. And there's other ideas that don't seem that way. And I look at all this and I'm very selective in what I take from other systems. One idea that I find very powerful from Chinese medicine, I have another colleague, an MD in New York, who practices what he calls modern Chinese medicine. And I once heard him say that if you could summarize all of Chinese medical philosophy in one sentence, it would be to dispel evil and support the good. In Western medicine, all of our focus is on dispelling evil. We identify what we see as agents of disease or causes disease, and we blast them with weapons, usually pharmaceutical. And we really pay no attention to supporting the good, which are the intrinsic the intrinsic resistance or defensive functions of the human body. And just as a concrete example of this, if you look at the way we manage gastroesophageal reflux disease, we use these very powerful medications that suppress production of stomach acid. We say that's the problem, is too much acid in the stomach, and we stop it with a very powerful drug. That's an example of the dispelling evil philosophy. We do nothing to support the defensive function of the body, which is how do you make the gastric mucosa more resistant to the erosive action of stomach acid. And there are various ways of doing that. There are natural products that do that, adjustment of diet. I see so many patients who are put on these medications without any dietary history being taken, without any warning of the addictive nature of these drugs, the long-term problems that they cause. I mean, that's the unbalanced Western approach that could really benefit from paying attention to that idea from Chinese medical philosophy.
Yeah, and the system, the modern medical system really feeds that, doesn't it? Because, as you said that, I had a flashback to, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, I'm going to guess, in clinic, a lot of patients waiting outside. This is much more conventional NHS general practice. And I can't remember the exact patient, but they'd come in, they'd still got these gut acid type symptoms. They'd already been on, I think they started off on a omeprazole, the proton pump inhibitor.
Yep.
Then the doctor had changed it. It wasn't working to lansoprazole. And then I think I had a protocol which said, there's a new one called esomeprazole. Let's try that. That's the third line that's recommended by the local hospitals. And you just get into this maddening vortex where, no one's understood the root cause of it. They've been put on one proton pump inhibitor. My understanding is that the early trials on proton pump inhibitors only looked at their use for a few weeks, 3-4 weeks
exactly
maximum.
Exactly.
Whereas now, people are on them for 10 plus years, just on repeat prescriptions.
Right. And this is a problem that I think is really not appreciated, that I've been trying to call people's attention to, both my colleagues and patients, that when you use these powerful counteractive agents long-term, you run into a problem I call the homeostatic trap, that the body will push back against what you're doing. So if you try to block the production of stomach acid with a drug, over time, the body is going to try to produce more acid. So if you lower the dose or stop the medication, there's going to be an outpouring of acid much worse than you had to begin with. And so people think, well, then I can't get off these. I have to take them. And over time, you are worsening or prolonging the problem. And the same thing happens with depression. Yeah. You give SSRI antidepressant drugs to increase serotonin at neural junctions. How is the body going to respond to that? It's going to try to, it'll make less serotonin, and it will drop serotonin receptors. So that if after a year of use, you try to get off that or reduce the dose, depression is increased. There's even a name for this now. It's tardive dysphoria, which is lingering depression as a result of treatment. And you see this again and again with so many of our pharmaceutical agents.
And there's a double problem, isn't there, Andrew? There's a problem that the person who initially came to the doctor with these heartburn, acid symptoms that were causing them problems at work or that when they went to sleep, because we didn't address the root cause then, we gave them a pill which may, unless we have been really clear that this is a short-term intervention to help your symptoms while we deal with the underlying root cause, which is where I think those things can potentially have value sometimes for some patients.
Yep. Short-term, yep.
If we explain that, but we disempower the patient, they start taking the pill, think, I've got a problem that I need this pill to fix. Yep. And then when they can't get off it, they think, it reinforces, I have that problem. I need the pill, or I can't function, without realizing your body is reacting. And it sounds as though we're talking about rare cases. I bet you, if you go to any general practice in the UK,
it's all over the place.
You will have hundreds, if not thousands of patients at every practice who are in this situation. And it's so frustrating because once they're on it, it is challenging to get them
Very challenging. Very challenging. And by the way, Rangan, when I was growing up in the late 1940s, 1950s, gastric reflux did not exist. People had heartburn, And they dealt with it mostly by taking calcium carbonate, mint-flavored calcium carbonate, which is relatively safe. And I think most people understood that heartburn was your stomach's way of telling you that you'd mistreated it. Either you ate too much, you ate the wrong things. But now this has become completely medicalized into this condition, due to too much stomach acid, and you treat it with these powerful medications and then go about your business. And as I say, almost every patient I see who is in this situation where they're dependent on the drug and can't get off, they were started on them without any questions being asked about what they were eating, were they drinking coffee, were they smoking, what their stress levels was. No inquiry into any of that.
Yeah. Or how stressful their lives were.
Yeah.
Were they eating on the move while,
Yeah.
it sounds so basic, but there's almost always a way to help people with those symptoms if you take the time to understand what's causing them in the first place. And you're spot on. It's this medicalization of symptoms, whereas, it's the body sign. It's trying to talk to you and raise. It's trying to scream at you. You got to do something differently, right? You're not treating me well. But instead of listening, I guess it's reflective of just how busy and stressed out people are now, whether it's the doctors in practice, whether it's the patients in their busy lives, that it's almost, it kind of feels like it's the perfect storm. Medicine has got these quick fix solutions for busy people who don't feel they've got the time and energy to make change. And then you end up in this really problematic and quite toxic situation.
Well, this is the perfect opportunity for doctors to be teachers, and to be able to explain to patients why long-term use of these counteractive pharmaceutical strategies is not wise, that it's going to get you into worse trouble, and may produce bad effects of its own, and what the root causes of these things are and what changes you can make. That's what we should be doing. And it is very rewarding to do that and to see, good results.
Yeah. You mentioned the placebo effect before and the power of the mind. And I've shared on this podcast before that my realization over the past few years has been, yes, food, movement, sleep, stress, super important. They are very, very important things to try and help everyone with. But actually, if you go one step further, I really am feeling more and more that it's the mind, it's our belief systems up here, how we view the world actually determines a lot of those behaviors in the first place. And unless we tackle that, we can make big improvements with food and movement and stress. But at some point, to really get that long-term change, we've got to tackle what's going on up here. And you mentioned the placebo. And it's interesting that there's such powerful research behind the placebo, but how do we talk about it in medicine? It's the most derogatory thing in the world when you were talking about trials, isn't it? It speaks to how little credence we give or have typically given to the power of our minds.
Yes, the two most common usages of the word placebo I hear in medicine are, how do you know that's not just a placebo effect? And the most interesting word there is just, or we have to rule out the placebo effect. We should be ruling it in. Placebo responses are pure healing responses from within, mediated by the mind. And that's what we should be trying to make happen more often. That is the art of medicine. How do you present treatments to patients to get the maximum healing response with the minimum direct physical intervention? Again, something that I began writing about long ago and talking about, and I'm happy to see gradually a change coming about in that area. But that word is so charged and so loaded, and the thinking that placebo responses are imaginary and they're not as important. There's a little assignment that I like to give to medical students and also to doctors in training as well, is to pick up any medical journal at random that reports randomized controlled testing of drugs, and look up an article and flip to the back where there's a table summarizing the results. In the placebo group, there will always one or two or a small number of subjects who show all of the changes produced in the experimental group. In other words, any change that we can produce in the human body with a pharmaceutical agent can be exactly reproduced in at least some individuals some of the time purely by a mind-mediated mechanism. To me, that is the most important single fact that's come out of this whole era, 70 years of randomized controlled drug testing. And that's what we should be trying to figure out how to take advantage of and make happen more of the time.
It's something that doctors who I train ask a lot. They say this, and I'm assuming you've heard this a lot as well. You know, Dr. Weil, Dr. Chatterjee, you know, I understand what you're saying, but, you know, patients just don't do what I tell them to do. Mm-hmm. And I find that language and that phrasing very telling in and of itself. What I tell them to do, I think, is potentially problematic. And there's this kind of thing that, oh, you know, I know everything, but the patients just don't do what I ask them. And one thing I teach doctors is when I get asked what's the most important thing I've learned in 20 years of seeing patients, my answer is always connect first, educate second. And I always say
and also to model behavior for patients, as I said this earlier, that you have to model, you have to embody the changes that you want to see in others. So you have to model health for your patient.
But I totally agree. And why I'm so passionate about that is I've realized that until the patient across the table from you has really connected with you, made eye contact, like really felt heard, I just don't think they're that willing or that engaged to then take the next step. Whereas if we just rush in to give the solution, it just doesn't work that well. And then if you take that outside medicine, because what is the patient-doctor relationship? Well, it's a relationship, isn't it? So how does it work with your partner or your wife or your children? You know, who responds well to just being told what to do? It's always about feeling seen, feeling heard, really having someone validate who you are and how you're feeling before you take that next step. And it's such an obvious thing. Again, we're not taught it in medical school, but for me, Dr. Weil, that is one of the big truths that I've learned from seeing thousands of patients. And I'm interested as to your view on that. Is that something you've come across before? Would you agree with that, or would you modify that?
I very much agree with that. By the way, one of the reasons that I like doing the 4-7-8 breath with patients is that it establishes a very intimate connection with the patient to breathe with them. They're not expecting that, they're not used to that, and I find that facilitates further connection. Also, a practical technique that we teach to the people that we train is motivational interviewing, and this is a technique developed recently. It's a dialogue that you have with a patient that helps you and the patient identify mental patterns that are obstacles to making changes in behavior and lifestyle, and then helping them develop alternative mental patterns that facilitate the changes you want. It's a very useful technique, and it's something practical that can be taught.
I mean, speaking of Hippocrates that you mentioned before, a phrase that popped into my mind was, I think this is Hippocrates, it's more useful to know what sort of person has a disease than what type of disease a person has. And I think that is, again, something I figured out over many years of getting frustrated and not being able to help my patients as much as I wanted to. I sort of came to that truth that way. And I guess speaks to the power of the mind and how we're all sort of individual. You know, you mentioned the power of the mind. Sorry, go, please.
No, you made me think. I just had a flash on being in medical school and being told by an attending physician, you know, go see the gallbladder in room 7.
Yeah. That says it all, doesn't it? Says it all.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that you've shared a story in the past where I think you had taken some form of psychedelic mushroom potentially, and whilst you were under its influence, you were able to do a yoga pose that you had that previously you weren't unable to do? I wonder if you could just share that story, because I think that really speaks beautifully to how our mind can get in the way.
It's an example of what the potential of these agents is. It was actually LSD, and I was, I think, 28, living in a rural area in Virginia. It was a beautiful spring day, and I took LSD with a group of friends outside. And I had been just starting to practice Hatha yoga. I had been doing it for, I don't know, a month or so. And one posture that I had a really hard time with is the plow. Where you lie on your back on the floor and you raise your legs and then try to touch your toes behind your head. I got my toes within a foot of the floor and I had horrible pain in my neck, and I just got stuck there. I couldn't do it no matter how much I practiced, and I was on the verge of giving up. I thought I was too old. My body was too stiff. And then on this day when I was under the influence of LSD, I felt terrific. My body felt really elastic. I was, wonderful. I thought, gee, I ought to try that. So I lay down and I was lowering my feet. I thought I had about a foot to go, and they touched the ground. I couldn't believe it. And I did it repeatedly. I was just so joyful to be able to do that. The next day I tried to do it and I got my feet within a foot of the floor and I had excruciating pain in my neck. But there was a difference. I now knew that it was possible. And up to that point, I didn't think so. And so I kept at it. And in another couple of weeks, I was able to do it. If I had not had that experience, I think I would have given up. So, I saw a possibility that I did not believe in, and that motivated me. And I think there's tremendous potential for psychedelics in medicine, not just in psychiatric medicine, of showing people that it's possible to experience their bodies in a different way. I think that's very applicable to chronic pain, for example, allergies, autoimmunity. But there's other ways of getting glimpses of that as well. One of them is simply meeting a person who's had your illness and is now better. And if I can arrange for patients to meet other people who are well, who've had their same illness, that's a very powerful way of overriding any negative predictions they've had.
You mentioned psychedelics, and sort of my feeling is that in America, at least the things and the interviews and the conversations I consume from America, a lot of quite prominent people seem to be talking about the potential value of certain psychedelics for certain conditions. And I think Johns Hopkins, I think lots of prestigious institutions, research institutions are now studying this. So I wonder, you're someone who was, I think, studying marijuana and its effects on health in the 1960s, a long time ago, maybe one of the first people to do this.
Yeah.
I wonder if you, for any listeners who are naive to this, who've never heard about this, you're a super well-respected doctor, you train at Harvard Medical School. Could you just outline, what are psychedelics? How can they provide utility for people, and why have they been demonized for so long?
Well, psychedelics there are two groups of them chemically. There are natural sources of them, and there are chemical sources of them. These are substances that I think have extremely low potential for toxicity, probably lower than any other drugs that we know of. They can produce very dramatic psychological effects that are quite dependent on set and setting, on people's expectations and on the environment in which they're taken. So the most common ones are LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, which comes from the peyote cactus. Psilocybin is from mushrooms. There is a drug called MDMA, which is slightly different category. Marijuana, cannabis is not a psychedelic, it's something else. But there was a lot of research interest in these in the 1950s, and some really wonderful research on them. And then it all got shut down when, in the wake of the hippies and Timothy Leary, and very restrictive laws were passed against them. And only now, recently, has this come about again. And it's not just in the U.S., although I think we're farther along. Canada is well along in making psilocybin available for the treatment of depression. And there's actually a lot of activity in the UK with psychedelics as well, and in some of continental Europe. I think this is happening all over, and that we're going to see very quickly that, I think we'll see psilocybin made available for the treatment of drug-resistant depression and anxiety, MDMA for PTSD, which is a huge problem in America among returning war veterans. So I think we're going to see these compounds made available for therapeutic use, but at the same time, there's tremendous interest in the general public in them. In the pre-COVID, when I was traveling a lot and speaking, whatever the subject I was talking about, whether it was healthy aging, integrative medicine, nutrition, the questions I got were about psychedelics. How can we make them? How can we find guides, experiences? Just tremendous mainstream interest. I think 2 months ago, Vogue magazine in the US had a cover story on psilocybin. That's kind of mainstream interest that's really remarkable.
Wow. So you mentioned before when we were talking about anti-inflammatory diets, you mentioned green tea. And I know you are a particular fan of green tea. In particular, from what I understand, it's matcha. Can you tell me about, when you became aware of matcha, what happened there, and why you're so passionate about people drinking more of it?
When I was growing up, tea was something drunk by old people and sick people. And I drank iced tea, heavily sweetened. When I was 17, I had a chance to live in Japan with Japanese families. And I really came to love green tea. Very good. And I'd seen nothing like that in America. And I was also introduced at that time to matcha in the Japanese tea ceremony. Matcha is the powdered green tea that's whisked into a froth and consumed in the tea ceremony. And I began bringing that back when I would go to Japan and turn people onto it. Nobody had ever heard of it in the States. And then sometime in the 1980s, I think this was again way ahead of its time, I formed a connection with a Japanese company that produced matcha and tried to sell it through my website, drweil.com, but it was not the right time for it. And then it's been quite amazing to me to watch how fashionable matcha has become in recent years. But I was concerned that most of the stuff that people were drinking was not good quality because matcha is so finely powdered that it oxidizes very quickly and it loses its bright green color and good flavor. And so I wanted to make really good quality matcha available. And I again formed a relationship with another Japanese company near Kyoto and formed a company called matcha.com, Matchakari, that's selling this. And turning a lot of people on to this. I think it's a wonderful product. First of all, there's a great deal of research on the health benefits of tea in general, on green tea in particular, a lot due to its antioxidant content. Matcha is different in that the leaves are grown in a way that increases the content of antioxidants. And it also has a high content of an amino acid called L-theanine that has a calming effect. And I think that modifies the effect of caffeine and makes the stimulation of tea and matcha in particular very different from that of coffee. It does not have the jangling effect of coffee. It does not leave you with a crash when the stimulation wears off. People say it causes a state of calm alertness that I think is very desirable. So I think it's a good thing. Matcha is also beautiful and delicious, and I'm going to have a bowl of it after we finish talking.
I really do want to spend the next 20 minutes talking to you about what I think is possibly the most serious but also undervalued components of our health, and that is stress. So stress is the health epidemic of the 21st century. Now, that's not me who's saying that. Does anyone know who says that? Maybe the UN does. I've seen it on the World Health Organization website. And I think that's pretty striking statements because they're not saying that about our poor diets, although that's clearly an issue. They're not saying that about physical inactivity, although that's clearly an issue. But they're saying that about stress. Now, there was a paper published in 2013 in the Journal of the American Medical Association that suggested that between 70 and 90% of what a GP like me sees in any given day is in some way related to stress. Does that surprise you? Yeah, see, and whenever I ask that question, it's always a mix. Half of the people saying, yeah, that's really surprising, half of people saying no. And for me, when I read it, it was quite surprising until I started to review the patients that came in and had to think about what was driving actually their ill health. And the reality is, I think it's true. I think it's spot on. Because as a GP, I see symptoms every day such as insomnia, poor memory, hormonal problems, inability to concentrate, low libido, gut problems, even things like obesity, type 2 diabetes. And actually all of those things, they might seem quite unrelated and quite separate, but you can make a very good case that all of them have stress as a key driver. So why is that? How can stress cause such a diverse range of symptoms? Well, to understand it, you just have to go back maybe 2 million years ago or so when our stress response was evolving. Because once you understand what stress is, you can start to apply that understanding to all the stressful episodes that you might experience in your life and the impacts they're going to have on your body. So let's go back a couple of million years ago. We are in our hunter-gatherer tribe, in our little community, going along with our business, and then there's a predator attacking. Let's say a lion is lurking. So what happens? Well, in an instant, our stress response kicks into gear. A series of physiological changes and biochemical changes all over your body kick in with one goal: to help keep you safe. Right? So what happens? Well, many things happen, but to give you an idea, your blood sugar will start to rise. That's going to help you run faster. That's going to help deliver more glucose to your brain. That's a good thing if you're running away from a lion. What else happens? Your blood pressure goes up. Your blood pressure, again, is going to deliver more oxygen to your brain. That's a good thing. There's a part of your brain called the amygdala. Okay, that's part of your emotional brain. That goes on to high alert. Right? So you're hyper-vigilant for all the threats around you. Again, that's a good thing in the short term. What else happens? Your blood becomes prone to clotting. Right? That means if you were to get cut and attacked by that predator, instead of bleeding to death, your blood's going to clot, and that's going to keep you safe. Right? These are fantastic mechanisms that help us in the short term. The problem today is that for many of us, our stress responses are not being activated by real danger, right? They're not being activated by lions and predators. For many of us, they're being activated by our daily lives, by our email inboxes, our to-do lists, conflicting demands, 2 parents working, one trying to finish early, go home, pick the kids up, 3 social media channels we're trying to stay on top of, elderly parents who might also be having to look after. The list goes on. But for many of us, those same things, right, are driving the same stress response. And it's problematic because in the short term, those things are really helpful, but in the long term, there are problems. So your blood sugar going up in the short term to help you run faster, if that's happening day in, day out, right, that's going to lead to excess weight, ultimately type 2 diabetes, just from being stressed. Blood pressure. We know high blood pressure is a big problem. In the short term, a good thing. You're running away from a lion. If you're in a spinning class at the weekend, you want your blood pressure to rise. That's an appropriate response to a short-term stressor. But day in, day out, if your life is stressing you out, the high blood pressure is going to increase your risk of getting heart attacks, strokes, etc., etc. What about your emotional brain, the amygdala? Right? Again, I said when you're being stressed and you're running away from that lion, it goes on to high alert, so you're hyper-vigilant for all those threats around you. Appropriate in that environment. Appropriate if tonight you're walking down a dark London street and you think someone is trying to attack you, you want to be hyper-vigilant. But if that's happening day in, day out to your life and your email inbox, right? Well, that's one of the things that we call anxiety. You see, all these things in the short term help us, but in the long term, they can be very, very problematic. So as well as those things that actually the stress response switches on, what about some of those things that switches off? Well, as a GP, I can tell you today, even more than 5 years ago, we're seeing more and more cases of low libido. And we're seeing it in younger and younger people. And there are many, many reasons for this. But stress is one of the main drivers. So why would that be? Well, if you are in danger and you are running away from a lion, you don't need to be able to chill out and procreate with your partner. So your body switches it off. Yeah. Gut problems. A survey by Mintel suggested that 80% of the UK population in any given year suffer from at least one gastrointestinal complaint. They are so, so common. And everyone goes to food as the key driver, and food is clearly a significant player here. But I've got to tell you, stress is an even bigger driver than the food that we're eating. Running away from a lion, the last thing you need to do is be able to digest your food. And how many of us, right, and I include myself in this, are having our healthy lunch while we're also trying to juggle a million things and answer emails at the same time? I'm sure nobody in here dreams of doing anything like that, but certainly that's something we're all faced with. So once you understand what the stress response is, you start to understand how it can affect so many different complaints. Now, I actually contend that it's not that hard to manage the stress of the modern world, okay? It's getting harder and harder, but I think there are some simple strategies, and that's why I wrote my book, The Stress Solution, because I don't think stress is getting the airtime it deserves. I think when we talk about health and well-being, the conversation is dominated with diet and exercise, and of course they're important, but more often than not, stress is the reason why we're choosing the diets and choosing those to be physically inactive. You know, how many people in January want to give up sugar or give up alcohol? Right, it's common. And for a week or two, you know, they might manage it. But then what often happens is that the sugar or the alcohol was there to soothe the stress in your life. So if you don't address the underlying stressor, you're very, very unlikely to change the behavior long term. So look, I cover, in my book, I cover all the simple strategies that you would expect, like breathing, meditation, nature, all kinds of things that absolutely do help, meaning and purpose, and give tips on how you can start to get meaning and purpose in your life. But I want to touch on two areas today that I think aren't spoken about enough of in the context of stress. The first one is loneliness. Okay? So, loneliness is on the rise. Some people say that we're living in a loneliness epidemic. And when we talk about loneliness, we immediately start to think of the elderly. And I understand that. I understand that loneliness affects a lot of the elderly, and it is a problem. But one of the loneliest groups in society are young men between the ages of 30 and 45. And at this age group, tragically, there are growing rates of mental health problems, growing rates of male suicide. In fact, it was just a few days ago, it was National Suicide Prevention Day. And it's a big problem in that age group, and loneliness is a key driver of that. You see, we're living these ultra-connected lives, right? And we say we're more connected than we've ever been before. And sure, in a digital sense, I think that's true. But in terms of real, deep human connection, I don't think we've ever been this isolated. Recent research is suggesting that the feeling of being lonely is as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Does that surprise people? Yeah, most of you nodding your head. So why would that be? Why would the feeling of being lonely be that damaging for you? Well, it all makes sense if you go back a couple of million years ago, right? Back when we were in our hunter-gatherer tribes, if you are by yourself, you're not part of that supportive community, your body's smart. Your body knows that you are vulnerable to attack. So it prepares you for that. It ramps up your immune system. It makes you inflamed. It makes your blood prone to clotting. It does all of these things so that if you do get attacked, you can protect yourself. The problem is now, in this era where we're so busy, we don't have time to see our friends. We don't have time to do the things that mean the world to us and see those people. You know, our bodies are reacting in the same way. It was just last year I had a patient who came to see me, a 37-year-old chap. And on the outside, he was really, really successful. He was running his own business, self-employed, he drove a sports car. You know, you would have thought, hey, this guy's got it all together. He came to see me and he said, Dr. Chatterjee, look, I'm a bit worried here. I struggle to get out of bed some days. I'm struggling to stay focused at work. I'm really struggling with motivation. And I'm really worried that I've got something called depression. You know, can you help me? So I spent time talking to him, trying to understand what was going on in his life. We did do a few tests and investigations. Everything came back normal. And as I was getting to know him, I realized that actually he was quite lucky in the sense that he lived in a village where he grew up. And he had lots of his friends around him, but he never actually saw them. He was too busy. He said, you know, I see what they're up to on social media. And that's the funny thing about social media, right, isn't it? You can see what your friends are up to. You can see the holiday snaps. You can see where they were last night. You can see what they had for dinner last night, right? But you don't actually see them. And I said to him, look, what I'd love you to try is, for the next 6 weeks, I'd like to see one of your friends at least once a week in person. And when you're with them, I want you to put your phone away. Be really, really present for that interaction. He said, yeah, sure, okay, give that a go. So he goes away. I see him in clinic 6 weeks later, and I ask him, I said, how are you getting on? He said, Dr. Chatterjee, I feel like a different person. I can't tell you the difference it's made. I feel motivated. My self-esteem has improved. I'm more productive at work, and my concentration's better. I said, well, what did you do? Well, he said the first couple of times I played five-a-side football with my friends, which we haven't done in years. But then after that, all we did is on a Sunday morning, we'd go to the local cafe and chew the fat over a latte. So, you know, my question is, did that young lad, well, not a young lad, did that young man have a mental health problem? I mean, he certainly had symptoms that would be consistent with mental health diagnoses, potentially. But was it not that what he really had was a deficiency of friendship in his life? And when he corrected that friendship deficiency, other things started to come back online for him. Now, I'm not trying to say this happens in every single case, right? Medication has a role at times. I do happen to think we are over-medicating people up and down the country with a whole variety of basically lifestyle-driven symptoms. I certainly think that's happening in medicine today. But isn't that powerful? So my question to all of you in here is to ask yourself, when was the last time you saw one of your friends in person? Right? Because I say that seeing your friends in person is not a, how could I put it? It's not a luxury for good health. It's a necessity. And if you haven't got a date in the diary, if you haven't seen them recently, maybe at your coffee break or your lunch break, send them a text. Put a date in the diary. It is good for your health, right? Prioritize it in the same way that you would prioritize eating your vegetables with your dinner. And it's something that I think the modern world, as it steals more and more time away from us, seeing our friends is something that actually, for many of us, falls by the wayside. The other issue I want to talk to you about, which I don't think has been spoken about in the context of stress and well-being, is passion. Right, so the research is pretty clear on this. Regularly doing things that you love makes you more resilient to stress. Right? And we are living in stressful times. So, you know, yes, we would ideally reduce how much stress is in our lives, but that can be challenging. So making ourselves more resilient to stress is a fantastic way of tackling this. Right? So regularly doing things you love makes you more resilient to stress. But it works both ways. Being chronically stressed makes it harder for you to experience pleasure in day-to-day things. Right? Your brain is always responding to the information that you feed it. So, I'll give you another story. 53-year-old chap came into my clinic. Okay? He's the local CFO of a plastics company, very successful job. And again, he's concerned that he might have depression. He says, Dr. Chatterjee, I just feel indifferent. I just can't get going. I don't have time to do the things I want to do. I'm just disinterested in my job, in my work, in my family life. Is this depression? So I started to ask him about his life. What's going on? So you've been married for 20 years. Okay, how's your marriage? Yeah, so. I don't really see my wife that much, but things are okay. He was very, very indifferent about it. So what about work? You've got a good job. Do you enjoy it? Not really. Pays the bills. I've got to do it. Puts a roof over our heads. I said, do you do anything that you love? What do you do as sort of recreation? I said, Doc, I don't have time for that. I'm busy. I said, what about weekends? Weekends, I've got the household chores to do. I've got to take the kids to sports classes. I don't have time. So, again, I did what is appropriate of me as a GP to sort of check other aspects of his life. But then I started to really push him on this passion piece. I said, did you ever have any hobbies? I said, Doctor, I used to have hobbies, yeah. As a teenager, I used to love train sets. I used to play with them loads. I said, okay, do you have a train set at home? He said, yeah, well, I've got one at home, but it's in the loft. I said, okay, look, what I'd love you to do tonight is when you get home, is get your train set out. I appreciate that may not be the advice that he was expecting to get from his GP, but nonetheless, that's the advice I gave him. Then he goes away, and I get on with my day. And as typically happens in general practice, you cannot follow up every single patient that you see. We see sometimes 40 to 50 patients a day. You cannot follow them all up. So I hadn't seen him for a while. 3 months later, I finished my morning surgery. I was in the car park, about to go out to do my home visits, and I bumped into his wife, and I said, hey, look, how's your husband getting on? I said, oh my God, Dr. Chatterjee, I feel like I've got the guy I married back again. I said, well, what's been going on? He said, well, I come home from work, and he comes home from work, and he's straight away playing around on his toy set. He's on eBay buying collector's items, and he's subscribed to this magazine now, and he's just so happy. Now, I didn't see him for another 3 months when he came in for a well man's check, and he came in to see me with his blood results. And I remember him coming in, and I said, hey, look, how are you getting on? He says, Doc, I cannot tell you the difference. Things are so much better. I love that train set. And I said, what about, how's your marriage? He goes, things with my wife are much, much better. I said, how's this job that you weren't enjoying? He goes, love it. Really, really enjoy my work. And the point I'm trying to make there is that, did he have a mental health problem? Again, he had symptoms that were consistent, right? You could make some sort of diagnosis there if you wanted to, potentially. But I'm just trying to make the case that he probably had a deficiency of passion in his life, right? And when he corrected his deficiency of passion, things started to come back online. So again, my request to each and every single one of you is, when was the last time you did something that you absolutely love? If it's recently, great. If it's not, I'd love you to think about giving, regular doses of passion the same priority that you would go to the gym or moving your body. It's as important, yet we don't feel we've got time for it. If you think you don't have time, even 5 minutes a day. We've all got 5 minutes a day. It could be reading a book, going for a walk, listening to a podcast, coming home from work, putting on YouTube and watching your favorite comedian for 5 minutes. It doesn't matter, but a daily dose of pleasure and passion is super important. There are so many other things we could talk about when it comes to stress, but I really want to touch on those two things because I don't think we're talking about them enough, and I think they're important. But I just want to leave you with this. Stress does not take a day off in the 21st century, so I don't think we can take a day off from managing stress. I think we all need a stress reduction strategy these days. I really do. And What we don't realize is that stress is everywhere. Okay? Just because we can't see it like we can see the food on our plate doesn't mean it's not there. It is there. It affects our short-term health and our long-term health. I mean, the research is now suggesting that chronic stress is a causative factor in the development of Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's doesn't happen overnight. Alzheimer's starts about 30 years before you get it in your brain. I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying that to empower you so that you actually take this seriously and start doing simple things each day that really make a difference. I promise you, once you make managing stress a daily priority, not only will your stress levels come down, but you're going to start feeling calmer, happier, and I think you'll start to lead a much more fulfilling life. And what could be better than that?
If we move on to nutrition, Tommy, in terms of what kind of things we should be eating to build a healthy brain, I'd be interested in your view there. And also, I wonder if you could touch upon why a healthy brain is important, because we want to build a healthy brain, and then often we think about the other extreme, which is when our brain doesn't work when we're 70, or it doesn't work as well. But we forget that there's this long latent period where our brain function can start to decline before we even get symptoms. So just a couple of things there, which I wonder if you could just sort of expand upon.
Yeah, sure. So actually, before we get into that, you mentioned earlier about this hyper focus on nutrition in terms of what's essential for long-term health. And when I think about the things that a healthy body, a healthy brain requires long-term, right? So nutrition is important, but so is sleep or circadian rhythm, right? Light when it's light, dark when it's dark, movement, some kind of stress mitigation, and then social connection. Probably those are the things that I think are going to underpin most of the stuff. Those are the biggest rocks that you can move to improve long-term health. And I think that the more you neglect any one of those areas, the more you have to become hyper-focused in another. So when people are talking about restricting from a dietary sense, and that could be total calories, it could be fat, it could be carbohydrates, it could be protein, all of them have been vilified by different groups for essentially the same reasons. I think that the reason why we had to become so hyper-focused and so restrictive to a large degree, and actually any one of those approaches can have benefit depending on the person in front of you. It's because we were neglecting the other things. We're neglecting movement, we're neglecting sleep and circadian rhythm, we're neglecting social interaction, social connection. And so that's one reason. It's also something that's very easy to sort of like quantify, whereas it's hard for me to say, it's easy for me to say, oh, you should stop eating carbohydrates. It's much harder for me to say, oh, you should go and make new friends, right? That's much harder. And so I think that's one reason why we're hyper-focused. So the more you neglect the others, then you have to sort of like really sort of focus in on another one, because those other systems are not getting the attention that they should. In terms of building a healthy brain, I mean, the easiest way to think of it in my mind is, well, what is a brain made up of? And it's mainly made up of fat and cholesterol. And that in our modern nutrition environment sounds very scary. I'm not telling you that you need to eat a whole load of fat and cholesterol. Actually, your brain makes its own cholesterol, and it makes it from precursors that could be glucose or could be ketone bodies. When you're a baby, ketone bodies are essentially the preferred precursor for making new fats, making new cholesterol. But one of the things that's very important is DHA, the long chain omega-3 fatty acid that you get in seafood. And there's going to be some variation in terms of what amount people need. And it's probably going to be based on their ancestral background. So there's some evidence to suggest that people who are of a more northern ancestry, so people like me, we got most of our long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids from seafood. So I'm probably going to do better with more, direct from the source. Whereas people who live close to the equator may have gotten more sort of precursors like alpha linolenic acid, which is the omega-3 that you might get in nuts and seeds, and then we make our own DHA. And there's a whole host of other things that can influence that, but there is going to be some sort of individual variation. It's just the point that I'm trying to make. But DHA is incredibly important, and it's accumulated very actively in the brain in the last trimester of pregnancy. So the last 3 months or so. And it's basically being actively, depending on the amount in the mother, it's being actively regulated how much is passed on to the baby. And then basically all of it is ending up in the brain. And then some is put in the fat stores. And humans are the only primate that has significant fat stores when it's born. And that's largely because it's a repository of these important things to then support the brain. And again, because babies are born with an incredibly demanding brain, human babies, and it's, we need these fat stores to support it. It's one of the reasons that we have the brains that we do. So DHA is incredibly important. Lots of other things, will come up. So things like choline can be very important. Again, you might get that from eggs, liver, organ meats, potentially. And then when I think long-term, something that is probably having a negative effect on the brain is really large swings in blood sugar. And there's a lot of data to support that. If you're eating foods that cause very, very big spikes in blood sugar, that's probably over time going to have a negative effect on your cognition. And there are some studies that suggest that in people with diabetes, if you improve their blood sugar control, you improve their cognitive function. And this can happen over years, and again, we're normally told that it's like this inexorable decline over time, whereas actually we have plenty of evidence that suggests that we can reverse that as long as we improve some of these factors. So it's just, I think it's very positive and empowering to say, wherever you are today, there is potential for improvement if you're, sort of capable and able and interested in doing that.
There's a few different threads there. So you mentioned DHA, you mentioned that potentially your ancestry may influence what you thrive best on. So you were talking about yourself and how your ancestors probably got a lot of seafoods. And then you mentioned people who might, like my own ancestry would have been, from India, sort of near the equator. And potentially we can actually make that DHA that typically you would get from seafoods. We might be able to make that from non-animal sources.
Yeah.
It's interesting that my ancestors potentially did that, but then my parents emigrated to the UK. I've been born and brought up here. So my microbiome, I'm sure, has changed significantly to adapt to my new environment. So there's a whole world of complexity here to try and unpick as to what someone like me should potentially do then. Is it more to suit the local environment where I live? Is it more to do with how my ancestors lived? But then I think the wider point for me is there is this big sort of debate, isn't there? DHA important for the brain. So typically you get that from seafood and animal products. And then people who prefer plant-based diets are saying, well, you can take ALA or we can supplement to make that. And I think the truth is that different people probably do well on different approaches depending on all kinds of different factors. But how would you unpick your way through that?
I think where we are currently, it's very difficult for me to say, because of your ancestry, because of what generation of immigrant you are to your current place, to then say this is how you should or shouldn't eat. I believe we'll get to a point where we can do that. I believe very strongly that you can't use genetic testing to tell you what you should eat. Most of that is complete nonsense. And so this is kind of in that box. So when I'm talking about, particularly polyunsaturated fatty acids, there have been studies where they look at whether populations based on their ancestry do better with plant or animal-based sources of PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3s and omega-6s. And so in broad strokes, I can tell you that people of your ancestry will probably do better or are more likely to thrive using plant-based sources than mine. But that doesn't mean that you will do better on plant-based sources than I will, or vice versa. So I think a lot of the confusion, and this can come from pretty much any area in health, the confusion comes from conflating what can we say on a population level versus what can I recommend the individual. And they are very, very regularly not, they are essentially mutually exclusive. I can't take anything from a population level and say this will definitely help this individual. Now, both are important because you may want to identify groups at risk for certain conditions. And then, all of medicine is applying statistics and hoping that you're going to improve an outcome, right? So when you do a clinical trial, you see, you give half the group an active drug, you give half group placebo, you generate something called the number needed to treat. How many people do you need to treat so that one will benefit? And often that number is quite high, right? So you're treating a lot of people so that one will get benefit on average, right? So there's almost no example in medicine or health where the same thing helps everybody. So all we're doing is playing the statistics, and this is just unfortunately how we have to work currently, and things will improve over time. So for fats, I think it's very difficult. We'll get to a point where we can measure some of these things, but if I measure the omega-3s and omega-6s in your blood, it's a very, very poor indicator of what's in your brain, because there are transporters, other mechanisms that are regulating that. So some people would say, well, you just measure the omega-3s in the blood, that will tell you something about the brain. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But again, these things will improve. However, one area where we have made some improvement is in blood sugar control. And there have been some really interesting studies, first from the Weizmann Institute in Israel, then Tim Spector's group in London have done some similar work. And basically looking at, based on an individual food, a person, when they're eating it, what the sort of the context of that food is. Have they exercised recently? Is it breakfast? Is it lunch? Is it dinner? Their genetics, their microbiota, all these, their metabolic health in general, what their fasting blood sugar is. Then there's a huge amount of variability in how different people respond to the same food. So if I eat a banana, I'll have a very different blood sugar response to when you eat a banana, and all of those factors are going to play a role there. So I think we can, to a certain extent, that we're starting to get to a point where we'd hope to be able to predict it, right? So maybe I can measure some things in you, and then I'll say, well, this is how you're going to respond to banana, this is how you're going to respond to pasta, this is how you'll respond to a cookie. But we can also do it ourselves to a certain extent. So we can, there's increasing interest in continuous blood sugar monitoring, or just testing your blood sugar after meals, see how you respond. And again, this is not something that I'm not saying everybody needs to do it. I'm just saying this is probably the area where we're the closest to being able to understand into individual variability. And even then, it's quite an intensive process, and that's just with blood sugar. So then when you think about all the different fats, all the different micronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, we're really miles away from being able to understand how one person should eat for their individual health. So then it really comes down to personal preference to a large extent, and then some kind of iterative process whereby maybe you do some blood tests, or maybe you just how do I feel, right? Subjective quality of life, subjective health is one of the best predictors of long-term health. And so we, at the moment, we just have to be guided by some of that, because the rest, people are working on it, but it's incredibly complex and we're not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, that question, how do I feel? So powerful, but just hardly ever spoken about. It's about, like I say, on this podcast, this is about helping people become the architects of their own health, which is the place I want to put them into, where they feel, yeah, I can absorb this information from the experts, or from people who've got experience in a certain area, but then I can start to put it through my own filter and go, well, does this work for me? Does it work in the way I live my life, with my family, with my work patterns. You know, and I think we've forgotten a bit of that, I don't know, that autonomy, that sort of sovereignty, that actually sometimes we know what's best for our bodies, not somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there has to be more humility in people who talk about any given approach to improve health, because if you actually go out in the real world and apply it, you're going to see it fail a lot. And again, that's not, I don't think that's a depressing message. I think it's just a reminder that humans are incredibly complex. And we essentially are the species that we are because we can thrive in almost any environment, right? There is no other multicellular organism that can thrive in the variety of environments and with the variety of exposures that we can. And so all of those things are going to change what is going to be best for an individual. So when you see any given approach fail, you then have to step back and say, well, hey, this is a useful tool. It's going to work for some people. Or, this is a useful tool for some people, but it didn't work for me. And that's fine, right? There's no arguments to be made there. And like you said, the question, like, how do I feel? How does how do I view my health? Even, 30 years ago, a question of somebody's subjective health, how do you rate your health, was one of the best predictors of longevity and mortality, right? On a scale of 1 to 4, very good, not very good or poor, something like that. And so just asking yourself that question over time, as you make changes, being mindful of, how is my body responding? Am I moodier? Do I feel less good when I go for my walk? Do I feel less able to concentrate? These can be really good indicators. But again, becoming really hyper-focused on something does have its detriments. But looking inwards and just, checking in on yourself, how do I feel after I've made this change? Is it, positive or negative? I think is going to get you a good chunk of the way.
Yeah. Back to brain health. We were touching on DHA, we were talking about ancestry, and just to sort of complete that then, you're saying that DHA, the fat, is an important component for brain health in the womb when you're growing, but also throughout life? And if so, what are those sources and how can we think about taking practical steps on that?
Yes, so particularly important in the womb, or potentially if you're born prematurely, which is a group that I frequently work with, then making sure they're getting that during that period when they would have otherwise been in the womb, and then throughout life as well. And so your fat tissue is incredibly important. And one of the reasons why it's incredibly important is because it acts as a store for DHA. So some people estimate that the average person has maybe 10 years worth of DHA for their brain stored in their adipose tissue. So that means in their fat tissue. So that means that you don't need to have it every day. You don't need to be overly worried about how much you're taking in because you have a buffer. That's one of the best ways to describe your fat tissue, is an incredibly important buffer. But if you were to take in no DHA and you're somebody who isn't very good at converting it from plant-based sources, or you're not getting plant-based sources because you eat a highly refined modern diet, then there is you're going to run out of that store eventually. And so I'm a big fan of seafood, small fish. If we think about, there is a risk of mercury contamination, some other things in larger, tuna and swordfish and other things. So sardines, particularly good, shellfish, oysters. You can take, there are algal sources, krill sources. You can take as a supplement. Like if you're taking it as a supplement, 1 or 2 grams a day is probably going to be enough for most people. If you're eating it from seafood, a portion once or twice a week is probably going to be enough. So it's not a huge amount, but longer term, I think it's definitely going to have an effect. The other side of that is vegetable oils. And there's if you exist in the nutrition space, there is a huge amount of controversy around vegetable oils, because some people will say if you replace saturated fat with vegetable oils, your cholesterol will be lower, and that's going to lower your risk of heart disease. Other people will say that vegetable oils are incredibly inflammatory; they're easily oxidized, and then that can then cause issues, including heart disease. And so I think there's a varied amount of evidence in both directions for those, and that's why it's complicated. But for the brain particularly, when we look at both the data that we have from humans, and it mainly comes from autopsies in children, and from animal models, including pigs, which are very similar metabolically in terms of their gut and their brain to humans, you see that if you have a large amount of linoleic acid, which is an omega-6, largely found in vegetable oils in our diet, if you have a large amount of that in the diet, it seems to outcompete DHA getting into the brain. So if we're just thinking about simple heuristics, not eating a lot of fried foods is probably going to be number one for a number of reasons, but that's going to be one because that's makes up a significant portion of the caloric intake or caloric content of fried foods and a lot of processed foods. And then just making sure that you're eating some kind of whole food sources of some omega-3s at the same time. So reducing your intake, just if you're eating whole foods and cooking them at home as much as you can. And again, there's a lot of privilege that's involved in being able to do that. It's not something we've talked about yet, but that's that we have to remember that as well. But if you're reducing the intake of those vegetable oils, again, just from sort of processed and fried foods, then I think most of the problem goes away. So you don't need to be like overly worried or really hyper focused on that. Just removing that component there, and then making sure you're getting some from whole either seafood or plant-based sources. That's probably going to be good enough, right? It doesn't require anything harder than that.
So you're saying that we've got these omega-3s, these DHAs, and we've got these omega-6s, which we were talking about. A lot of them come in the vegetable oils and in highly processed foods and fried foods, and they're sort of competing. So one option is to increase omega-3s, but you're saying actually a really good option that will have multiple benefits is reduce how much processed food you're having, how many vegetable oils are in your diet, and actually automatically that's going to mean ratio-wise there's more omega-3 there, and you're going to get all the knock-on benefits as well, beyond just vegetable oils and sort of oxidized vegetable oils that you get from whole food diets. Is that effectively what you're saying there, Tommy?
Yeah, exactly. And depending on the nutrition camp that you're in, people get very hyper focused on a specific intake, a specific ratio. They start looking at the omega-6 and omega-3 contents of all their foods and trying to increase, decrease one and increase another to improve the ratio. I don't think that anybody really needs to do that. I think if we just focus on reducing the most significant contributors, which have a number of potential negative health effects, which are processed and fried foods, and then we are just getting some whole food based sources, if it's fish once a week, or chia seeds in your morning porridge or something, which is a good plant source of ALA, which is a precursor to DHA. Just by doing that is probably gonna get you most of the benefit.
When we do talk about vegetable oils, is it the vegetable oils per se, or is it how they're cooked and if they're fried and if they're heated?
Yeah, I think both is actually important. So the linoleic acid, this main omega-6 in vegetable oils, in its native state seems to and I don't think we necessarily understand exactly how or why, but it seems to compete with DHA getting into the brain. And so, and if you have a huge amount of that as forming part of the fat content of the diet, then you seem to see less DHA in the brain. And that's regardless of how that oil comes. But equally, there's also some increasing literature on the breakdown products where it's become oxidized, which happens with high heat, repeated heating cycles. So if you think about the fryer at McDonald's, it's goes through multiple cycles on and off, being heated and cooled, and that's something that definitely increases the oxidation of the oil. And that seems to have a negative effect on brain health as well. There's some data in humans and then also in animal models. So I think it's a bit of both, really. However, I don't think we should be demonizing these things and just saying they're definitely bad, they shouldn't be in the diet. So, when we talk about vegetable oils, what are we talking about? So I'm talking, sunflower oil, refined rapeseed oil, which again is soybean oil. These are these are the ones used in commercial fryers in, fast food restaurants. Sunflower oil, not as bad actually, because it has a lower linoleic acid content. It's more monounsaturated fats, more like olive oil. So again, olive oil, a very good option. Coconut oil, avocado oil, butter, tallow. If you're a carnivore, you can use the rendered fat from your cow. So when you're cooking with these in normal amounts at home, I don't really think it's worth worrying about. Obviously, if you're deep fat frying at home, the same applies. But if it's just in a pan to saute some vegetables or cook a bit of chicken or something, I'm much less worried about that. I think, again, if we think about the big rocks that you want to move, if you're using a bit of sunflower oil at home to cook yourself a stir fry, rather than getting a big portion of chips that were sort of the total exposure and the nature of it is very, very different. So again, if you can bring it back to cooking whole foods at home, you're able to do that. You have the facilities and the resources to do that. Then I think a lot of the problem goes away.
There's talk that these oxidized fats can stick around in our body for a long period of time. And is that something that we should be thinking about? So, a lot of people like some fries, for example, which of course is likely to have been cooked in multiply reheated vegetable oils, which presumably will be super oxidized and drive inflammation in the body, I would imagine. Crisps are a very common snack here in the UK. I think even people who like to follow whole food diets find it really hard to resist, fries and crisps. And those things, of course, are highly processed. And just in terms of, one thing I love about your approach and why I think I resonate with it so much is because there's real balance there. There's real sort of, it's not about extremes necessarily. It's about saying, look, here are the big levers to turn. Don't worry about these small things if you're turning those big ones. And I just wonder, when it comes to things like fries and crisps, that oxidized fat can stick around, I think, in the body for quite some time. So it's not about demonizing it necessarily, but just helping people understand why they may not be the best choices, certainly in high amounts. I don't want to be too prescriptive, but I think we need to talk about these things.
Yeah, it's a very important question. And I think the natural tendency is for people to basically say they're terrible for your health, you should never eat them. And there's really no evidence to support that idea. Although, like, mechanistically, like you say, biochemically, yes, these things can hang around for a long time. But one of the most important aspects of all of this to me is to control the things that you can control, and then the ones that you can't control or you're not willing to control for whatever reason are things that you shouldn't worry about, right? And because I think that the process of worrying about it is worse than the process of doing the thing itself, right? So if you have a bag of chips once a month because it's your treat on a Friday night, I would much rather you do that and enjoy it, and it's part of your overall health and well-being, than worry about what the fat that's on those chips is going to do in your body. Like, I would really hope that you don't do that, because the effect of worrying is probably going to be more significant than the effect of the fat on the chips. So it's very much about just thinking about what am I trying to achieve? What can I meaningfully control that doesn't have a negative effect, right? Because if you feel like you're being restricted because you can't have your monthly Friday night chips, that's going to have a negative effect on your physiology. And people who feel more restricted dietarily then have some knock-on effects, like they have higher stress hormone levels and things like that. Like, it has an effect on your physiology. So to the extent that you can and are willing to change something, do that. That's great. It's going to have, it's definitely going to have an effect on your health. But when you get to a point where it feels restrictive long term, A, it's not going to be sustainable, and B, it's going to have a negative effect on you. So yes, I think that people should minimize their intake of vegetable oils and fried and processed foods. I still eat those things, and it's a big part of, occasionally, and it's a big part where it's important to me to, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to enjoy it and then not feel guilty about it, because the guilt is going to be worse than the food itself.
Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this conversation, there's loads more like it on my channel. Please do press subscribe and hit that bell. Now, back to the conversation. Hi there, this is a series of videos that Gary and I have created to help teach you about something called the Desk Jockey Workout, which is one of the workouts in my book, Feel Better in 5. Like everything else, it's designed to only take 5 minutes, and it's particularly good for people like many of us these days who actually sit down at desks. We're at keyboards, we're looking at screens, we're sort of hunched over, and that can have a lot of downstream consequences, whether it's a bit of pain, a bit of stiffness, or an impact on our posture. So this is a really great little workout, I guess, that I use with many of my patients. Gary taught it to me, and I think it's going to have a lot of benefits. So this video, we're going to teach you how to do movement 1. There are 4 movements, and there's going to be 3 more videos where you can see movement 2, 3, and 4. But movement 1 is called wall cogs. Now, it's probably not a movement that you're familiar with, so this one I think is quite careful. It's quite important that Gary actually shows you guys how to do it whilst teaching me. I mean, I do this movement, but it's very easy to get wrong. You don't need to worry about it too much, but hopefully, Gary, you can provide a bit of guidance here.
Yeah, sure. Well, a couple of things. We have this idea of good posture. We have a secondary idea of bad posture, and we've compartmentalized those in that way. Whereas what I'd like it to be able to do is for us to explore both good posture and bad posture using the wall, so that our brain can get a sense of how we move into both ends of that spectrum and mobilize all of the muscles, tissues and bones. So the wall gives us an opportunity to experience this movement in line with gravity, whereas we normally have a forward head or forward pelvis or something that's pulling us forward and out of that gravitational line. And the cogs is because we're looking at the idea of them operating like cogs on a clock. And so the first cog is your pelvis, and the second cog is your rib cage, and the third cog is your skull. And effectively what we'll do is I'm going to guide you to tilt this cog, and you'll see an opposite movement at this cog and an opposite movement at this cog, and that will create the spinal shape that we're looking
so you just talk me through. I will just pretend I've never done this before, and you just talk me through it.
Yeah, sure. So there's a few stages. The first thing is your feet won't be flat against the wall because you'll feel like that will pitch you forward. So an inch or two forwards, but generally your heels will be under your hip bones. Your back, your bum and your back, upper middle, upper back, and the back of your head will go against the wall. Now, some people will actually find that their head is so far forward, it's a long, long way back.
And I think, I must say that's something probably that I find quite difficult, and it's maybe because I've developed a forward head posture like many people have these days. But you can still do the movement, right?
You can still do the movement, and if it's really far forward, you can even use a book to support it, just to create a wall reference for you. So you can see with the lean back that the chin's lifted quite high. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is you take this part, the occiput, this lower part of your skull here, and you're going to slide it up the wall. And when that goes upwards against the wall, it will bring the nose down. And what you might notice with Rangan is as the nose comes down, you notice his ribcage start to lift up. And then I ask him to soften off again. So just goes back here and the ribcage drops down again. And slides up, the ribcage comes up and softens down again. And what we're effectively doing is starting to make the shape. So if you lead with the skull, the rib cage comes up, you'll see that he creates a space against the wall in the back. And then soften off again, Rangan. So the ribs come down, and I want you to go all the way until you flatten your spine against the wall.
So there's no gap anymore.
So there's no gap anymore. So in what we've got here is a little bit of space. So I'm going to ask Rangan to lift this up at the pelvis and you flatten the whole spine.
Yeah.
And then from here, you lead, pull yourself up tall and let everything follow again. So keep going up, up, up with the back of the head. And that creates the arch in the back. And then to drop down again and use that pelvis and rib cage pushing back to fill the space in the wall and then rise up again. Cool, so just a couple of those. And I'll just add in this idea of breath. So as you slide the head up the wall, you breathe in. So as you get this expansion of the rib cage, you breathe into the lower ribs and then breathe out as you go back in the opposite direction. Now we're going to look at, in another video, we're going to look at arm spirals, but I'm going to show you how they contribute to helping this movement as well. So as you are sliding this contact point up the wall, rib cage is rising, you generally gently start to rotate the arms out.
Oh, that's lovely.
And that will start to expand this even more and open up the chest. And as you come out again, so breathing out, bring the contact point all the way back to the wall. Let this rib cage just drop and the arms have rotated in. And then you can lead with your hands and slide the back of the head up the wall and sequence that all together. And so here, this is what I called at the beginning of the video, good posture. And if you flip out again, breathing out, arms rolling in, find the contact point against the wall. And this is starting to look like our bad posture, albeit head still over rib cage, over pelvis in that gravitational line. And so you're actually able to experience one position, the other position, which is a full opening of the front of the spine and an opening of the back of the spine, so that all the muscles either side get to be worked.
What I'll add, because I learned this a few years ago actually, when I first started studying with you, and it does take a little bit to get your head around this movement. It is quite a foreign movement to what we're used to, but it's worth persevering because you really do feel a really sort of refreshing kind of mobility in your spine and your chest, and you're kind of teaching the optimum way for the various parts of the body to actually move, aren't you? These three cogs, how they should be moving in conjunction with the other ones.
Well, they should be moving one on top of the other. That's the biggest challenge that we have. When the idea of a forward head, that everybody knows about a forward head, but what it does is it brings these three things off axis. So the head comes forward, leaves the hips behind, or pulls the rib cage forward, and no longer can they articulate in this way that they're able to. And therefore no longer are they able to target the muscles on the front of the neck and the back of the neck. You're going to end up in a very limited position. So exploring both, and I like what you were saying, you will find it hard. Many people find it challenging. It's not the easiest sequence to put together. But if your head is forward, for the first time you come back and start this movement, it's a brand new experience.
Yeah, and it would be easy to give just really simple exercises that are easy, you're sort of familiar with. But I think this one's a very, very important one because it addresses one of the big issues out there, I guess, mobility and posture-wise today. And there's many reasons for that, which we can maybe expand on at another time, or maybe in a podcast.
Love to.
But it's just something I think that really I've experienced a huge benefit. This one, as well as the other three movements in the desk jockey workout, once you get the hang of it, you can do it in 5 minutes, right? It doesn't take long. You don't need any equipment.
No.
You don't need to go to a gym. You don't need to buy anything. You don't even need to get changed. I've got many patients actually who do this, particularly ones who are sat down in offices, and hence the name, the desk jockey workouts. They do it at lunchtime, right at the start of their lunch break. They just spend 4 to 5 minutes doing this, and it just almost kind of resets things. And for many people, it can really help with back pain, neck stiffness at the end of the day, and all kinds of other issues. So I'm a big fan. I really encourage you guys to give it a go.
I think a lot of the movements come down to this idea of choice. So when I sit at a desk all day long, I'm in a fixed posture all day long. And I choose to sit in that posture all day long. And I then begin to forget all the other choices I've got, the one of standing up tall. And so we talk about making sure you can access both. So if you're going to live here, we don't need to come out and be here and categorize this as good. By being able to go in and out on a regular basis means that I'll choose somewhere that's more comfortable, where I can easily access both, and that's the choice.
And that's one of the things I really like about Gary's approach, is it's not really about good or bad, or good posture or bad posture. It's about, these are the range of movements that a human being can experience and should be able to experience, I guess.
It's
if we're
all there in our bone structures.
Yeah, if we're functioning optimally. And because of the way many of us live these days, and again, this is not me putting blame on people, I also live this way a lot of the time, it is having a consequence. And actually, by putting in 5-minute workouts, 5-minute movements like these into your day, actually you can change the consequence of the fact that you have a desk job.
Even at 60 or 70 years old, a few simple lifestyle changes with patients or with the public has been shown to increase their performance on cognitive tests. And I think that's really empowering for people when they think, oh, well, I didn't do this, I've had a stressful life. Yeah. Wait a minute, there are still things you can do.
It's not too late.
So let's go through, what are some of the things that people can do?
Let's do a 24-hour day. Consider skipping breakfast a couple of times a week. In neuroscience journals, and from what we know about the biology of it, that intermittent fasting, going 16 hours a couple of times a week without eating glucose, your liver will run out of its glucose reserves. It'll burn fat into these things called ketones. The brain is a hybrid vehicle. It's not all gas. It's not all electric. It likes both. And so if you have dinner at 8 and it's Monday evening, consider having your next meal be midday the next day. That's an easy way to get to 16 hours. It doesn't mean you're fasting for days and days. There is neuroscientific literature that intermittent fasting is good for attention and focus. I would consider taking 5 minutes to just breathe deeply like you're doing now. Just make deep breaths a couple of times a day, 3 times a day for 3 minutes. Make it easy. See how that works for you. Just the pause might be helpful. Now it's time to eat. The food you choose is important. And there's delicious food to eat that's actually good for your brain. And how do I know that? Well, we don't have a pill for Alzheimer's, but we do have the mind diet, which is essentially Mediterranean food, that if you look at a group of thousands of people over a long period of time, they had less dementia. So now that you've figured out the cadence of eating, which is intermittent fasting, skipping breakfast a couple of days a week, now that you've brought in pre-lunch 3 minutes of just deep breathing, that's meditative breathing, choose plants, choose nuts, choose occasional fatty fish. The fatty fish has omega-3s, which is an essential component of your brain. It's the wrapping around all those connections that keeps those electrical signals firing faster. And if you want to eat meat, consider the Mediterranean diet where it's fatty fish and poultry. Pass on the beef, pass on the fried food, pass on the processed food. Now, if you do have a burger, you're not going to undo what you did. Just make those things an indulgence rather than a habit. A bit of exercise is great. The brain likes exercise because it is flesh. Don't clog the plumbing to your garden, because swaths of your garden will wither. So people have strokes and injuries. It's because blood flow is not getting into their brain. That's the way to hurt the structure of your brain. So what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Then the other thing it does is it bathes itself in these neurotrophic factors. That's what my science is on, BDNF, brain drivers. And so that's what my grants are on. When the brain exercises, it showers itself. It's not like thigh muscles release healthy brain chemicals that swim up there. It's got its own pharmacy. You give it the right behavior and interaction, it'll reward itself. So exercise keeps the plumbing open to the flesh of the brain, as well as releases molecules that serve as miracle growth for the brain. A couple of times a week is a good place to start.
Do we know what specific exercise is good for the brain and good for BDNF levels?
Some people are starting to suggest some strength training is an essential component. So if you're just running a marathon, you might want to throw in some light weights. But a little bit more exercise than you're currently doing
is a good thing.
Is what the brain's going to say, hey, I like this direction. I'm going to shower myself with BDNF.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think we can, look, strength training, I'm a huge fan of strength training. I do think we undervalue muscle mass in society and in health. But generally speaking, for most of us, if we just increase how much we move,
Get vertical even.
yeah,
Get out of the chair.
That's gonna help.
Just the postural elements of standing is a first step. Next thing you know, you're walking. Next thing you know, you're taking the stairs. So these are simple things. These are free things. If you can, I like to read something completely unfamiliar. We've got a stack of old magazines. I just flip through just new content for your mind. And I think since it's thinking flesh, and of course it likes blood, it likes to be irrigated. Of course it likes a certain kind of diet because of the components it needs. But it also wants to think. If you ask Usain Bolt, I mean, how do you get your thigh muscles stronger? It's take some stairs. Well, how do you get your brain to be healthier? Think. And everybody's next level of thought and challenge is individual. We don't all have to do the same puzzles. We don't all have to have the same career, but get out of your comfort zone, if you will, just with the thoughts. So flip through something different on your phone, read something different on your phone, develop a new habit. I think that's important. And then for those of us who have creativity as an ambition, and I have the luxury of having creativity as an ambition because we're all wildly creative in our dreams. And people are finding that when you, on the transition from awake to asleep and from sleep to waking up, it's called hypnagogic and hypnopompic. There's actually those same alpha waves that we've been talking about just for 10, 20 minutes as you drift into sleep and your tasks are done. And Salvador Dali mentioned that. And like he uses sleep as a psychedelic tool for creativity to solve problems. It's not going to happen every time, but I like to look at my riddles at the end of the night and I have a notes app. And I write a few things and I wake up and I write a few things. That transition is like sort of a strange portal to your subconscious. And again, based on science, if you put some electrodes on a brain, at that time, you have those alpha waves that we talked about, awake, but focused and calm. And you also have these other waves, these delta waves that are light sleeping, early dreaming. It's the only time where you have both awake and asleep waves.
And I've heard in one of your articles, I've read one of your articles that you say, leave a pen next to your bed so that you can actually take advantage when those creative thoughts come just before bed or just when you wake up, you can actually just jot them down. That's incredible. You said learn new things.
Yeah.
How important can learning a new language be?
Oh, it's an essential thing. And whether you get it right is actually secondary. It's the process of trying to learn. So language, music, the act of learning makes your brain say, I gotta pull from different pathways. I gotta get to different corners of my mind. It's actually an energy consuming activity. And that's what engages the greatest corners and recesses of your mind is to learn new things, particularly music, particularly languages, social interactions. We know these things. And now I'm just trying to give you a biological basis that brain's efficient if it wants to fall into its rut. And breaking the rut in a constructive way is going to be good for your brain globally as your mind, thoughts and emotions, as well as the flesh. That's one strong way to stave off dementia.
Yeah, and that's very powerful, keeping your brain active, trying new things. And I think what you said was super empowering. It's not about whether you can actually master that language. It's not about whether you master playing the piano. Just the process of trying to, that's going to do all the groundwork and all the sort of heavy lifting in the brain, which is super empowering. What impact does music have on our brains?
That we know. And there's actually somebody in San Francisco or somewhere else, he's putting musicians in fMRI scanners, and those scanners don't tell the whole story, but they do tell something new compared to just putting electrodes on somebody's head. Our brain flesh is electric. I think of it as a jellyfish. The tentacles are spraying chemicals and electricity. We can detect it from the surface of the brain, and we can actually put people in machines and look at blood flow. And when you do that for musicians, it's really interesting. Because it's a physical performance, if you're learning to play music, I think I want to pivot from listening to music to learning to play music. That seems to be the thing that leads to the most left-right, right-left connections and electrical currents passing through the corpus callosum. Your brain's like a walnut. There's a bridge in the middle. And music, hearing it, playing it, thinking about it, using your fingers to control it, seems to pull from the most corners of our mind. And I can't imagine that not being good for you because, as you know, with the brain, if you don't use it, you lose it. It will down-regulate. It will let wither certain corners of the brain if they're not actively engaged. So I think music, especially when you're a kid, learning to play music, has to be good for the brain.
You know, our kids learning a new skill, whether it's a sport or a musical instrument, is likely to yield benefits. I think one of the reasons for me that might apply is because it often puts you into flow states.
Very good.
You know, and I think for adults as well, you know, when something's that, you know, it's not too difficult that it's unachievable, it's a little bit harder that you have to concentrate, you access that flow state.
I find those people who get into the flow state, and I think some people have may not know what that means, and they may think that's kind of fluffy, but there is a measurement for that. So when you're awake and resting and focused, those are alpha waves. If you look at, for example, sharpshooters, just the moment before they hit a target, likely athletes, a footballer scoring something, NFL quarterback, ballerina, the release from the constraints of thought that come from your frontal lobe and letting a well-trained behavior exert itself, the brain is actually less active. It lights up less brightly. It's more efficient in its pathways. And that flow state is an alpha wave that's detectable. Similarly with Buddhist monks, likely with deep divers before they do their dive. It's a state of being focused, awake, and calm. And I think our phones and the technology and everything we're doing is pushing us away from that. So if we can find skills and habits that let us harness that, channel it, know how to get into it, that would be great. And I think learning music, and like they say with music, learn it and then let it go, that's that alpha wave flow state that I think could be very beneficial for anybody to learn music.
When we learn a new skill, we are, rationally, we're thinking about it, we're trying to learn all those movements that we need. But then when we need to perform, we just want to have absorbed that, forget about, rationally thinking about everything and just let it go. Is that the key to allowing our brain to function at its peak? It's you learn and you then develop mastery and then you let it go. So you just allow it to perform.
Yeah. And I think let's dig into that a little bit deeper. I don't think when a surgeon is moving swiftly and with minimal trauma to tissue, or a footballer's making their moves and you're thinking, well, this seems effortless. They look relaxed. They're moving in a way that is efficient. It's not strained. You can see it in their face. They're not trying and thinking. Most people will have a flow state when they're not under pressure and the lights aren't on. The challenging thing for athletes is how to deliver that under the stress of a game-winning situation. And clutch performance, to me, that flow state is not performing better than what you would do in practice, but just doing what you would normally do under these extremely anxiety-provoking, stressful conditions.
So for people listening to this who are not high-performing athletes, I think there's a lot of take-home there for them. So I submit that we all want peak performance in our lives. Whatever our life entails, whatever we need to do, whether it's to be a father, whether it's to be a good office worker, be a neurosurgeon, whatever it is, we are all, I think, on some level, wanting to perform at our peak. So what can somebody listening to this or watching this on the video learn from what you've just said that athletes can do? How can they use that to help them in their daily lives?
The lessons we learn from athletes and ballerinas and other people apply to everybody. And so when we speak about what people can do when they're stressed out on an LA freeway, when they're about to go into a meeting with a boss and you're anticipating something not going well, when you're coming home and your relationship hasn't been good, the time-tested method and the one that we now know. See, I don't want to just tell you things without telling you how I know and why I have the privilege to be even asked that question. To me, it's meditative breathing. It's a very powerful way to quell that anxiety storm that those instinctive structures have done. I'm going to see my boss, and those subcortical structures are firing and they're unhappy. Much like you'd see a snake or you're at the edge of a cliff. There's certain things that should be released in your body, but those have been repurposed in a negative, destructive way where we feel that at work, we feel that at home, we feel that when we look at certain social media. How do we tamp that down? Just like we would slowly walk away from a fear of heights? How do we walk away from just the general anxiety that's filled our life during the day? And I deeply believe, and particularly now because there's hardcore data, and I'll go into this a little bit, is meditative breathing. I don't know what mindfulness is. I don't know what your mind is thinking, or my mind is thinking, or your mind is thinking. But I know that the brain is connected to the lungs and the heart through this thing called a wandering nerve. It comes down. And that the brain can send signals down to your heart, and Buddhist monks can slow down their heartbeat. I know when I put a little coil on there for people with epilepsy, kids with epilepsy, a vagal nerve stimulator, and we send electricity, the electricity can actually go upward into your brain and quell epilepsy. Epilepsy seizures are an aberrant electrical activity of your brain. Think of it as an arrhythmia of your heart is epilepsy of the brain. It's called a vagal nerve stimulator. It's been around for a while. This is something you can look up right now. We put electrical coil on this nerve, and it calms electricity. It's not even in the brain. But meditative breathing, deep breathing, and in a count of 4 to go in, a count of 3, 2, 1 to hold, and a slow release. If you do that just a little bit before you engage in that next stress-provoking task, it too works like a vagal nerve stimulator without us having to do a little surgery to calm the electricity in your brain. And you're saying, well, okay, that sounds, where did you get that? Well, we know, meditation's been going on for a long time. We've seen Buddhist monks do certain things, and others, deep divers are a great example of that. But we know this now because a study came out last year. They went through like meditative breathing with these patients and these kids and these young people, and they're watching the electricity change and get closer to that alpha wave, get closer to the calmer electrical signals in their brain after just deep, slow, deliberate breathing. It is a resource available to you that has been harnessed for millennia, and that now you have crazy brain surgeons providing you the electrical proof if you're a skeptical kind of person. To me, that's magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it brings a lot of weight to this term, just breathe. I mean, it's deceptively simple, but it really works. And I know this year I'll be giving a lot of talks to companies about wellness and how they can improve productivity. And what's really interesting is that a breath that I sort of use with my patients, something I've written about a lot, is the 3-4-5 breath. When you breathe in for 3, you hold for 4, and you breathe out for 5.
Yep.
And when I'm talking to people, a group, I'll often will collectively do just one of those breaths together, which takes about 10 or 12 seconds.
Yeah.
And I ask people straight away, how do you feel? Can you feel a difference just on one breath? And about 80% of people put their hand up. And that's just one breath. You do that a few times. As I say to them, 5 of those 3-4-5 breaths takes 1 minute. You will put your body in a different state because breathing is like information for your body and it's responding. So it's interesting that, you as a neurosurgeon before a big operation will use breathing.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for allowing people to find things about themselves that can help themselves, because that in itself is power also.
I always like to lead the listener with some really actionable, practical tips that they can apply in their own lives immediately to improve the way that they feel or improve the way that their brain functions. So what are your top 4 tips for people listening to this that they can think about applying into their own life?
One would be get vertical. That's the most essential thing. When I see our patients who can come out of a bed and stand, they grow. You can see a withering flower come back to life if they can get vertical. Being standing and moving is very important for you. Wherever you're at, just do a little bit more. 2, make subtle but important changes in your diet. Get rid of the red meat and fried food. Add in some more of the Mediterranean diet. You're still going to enjoy what you're eating. You can have a glass of wine, salmon, red wine, yogurt, fruit. It's not a tough thing. It's just changing the direction of what you're eating. Find some puzzles, find some content, read a book, do something unusual. That will also be good. And the 4th one I would say is, try to find happiness. It's the most elusive thing. But we also know that people who have mental health issues or people who are depressed, their brains start to change. They are brain injured from the way they are thinking. So if it's within your power to be happier, to pursue relationships and crafts that make you happy, that will probably be the best thing for your brain.
If that conversation resonated with you, here is another incredibly powerful one that I really think you're going to enjoy. Give it a click and let me know what you think. We shouldn't apply that same sledgehammer approach
to these chronic diseases that actually have got lifestyle as a root cause.
That's going to have an impact on your alertness, on your mental functioning, on your mood. But it's more than that.